live.
Go ahead,
We are
Abhigyan.
live. Yeah.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone joining us here today. I am Vigilant, intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, and I am pleased to welcome all of you to this week's edition of ICS Wednesday Seminar. Today's seminar is titled China's Overextension in South Asia. China's increasing presence in South Asia has been a topic of much discussion and concern, with many questioning the implication of China's growing influence in this region in both India and the West. Today's presentation explores China's strategic interests in South Asia by focusing on Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. It examines the drivers of China's foreign policy with regard to these three countries, along with highlighting the obstacles and apprehensions Beijing currently faces in its bilateral relations with them. It argues that China has transitioned from following a non-interference approach to South Asia to a more overt role. With this increased involvement in the country's domestic politics and getting caught up in domestic political and security issues, China appears to have overextended its engagement in Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Thus, rather than achieving its foreign policy objectives, Beijing is likely to get distracted, having to react to developments rather than paving the way for deeper engagement. Nevertheless, China's influence in the region and its ability to recalibrate should not be underestimated, and India should remain vigilant. Joining us today to discuss this is Mr. Shantanu Roy Choudhury, a research associate at the Institute of Chinese Studies with an interest in China's relations with the South Asian region. Mr. Roy Choudhury is the author of The China Factor, Beijing's Expanding Engagement with Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, published by Routledge in 2023. He has an MPhil from the University of Oxford, St. Antony's College, where he focused on the international relations of South Asia. I'm also honored to welcome the chair, Ambassador Ashok K. Kanta, former director of IST and a career diplomat with extensive experience in both China and South Asia. Mr. Kanta has served as the Indian ambassador to China and Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka and Malaysia. In addition, he has served in various roles in Indian diplomatic missions to Hong Kong, Nepal, Singapore, and the USA. He was also secretary at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi, with responsibility over 65 countries in India's extended neighborhood. I'm confident that their insights and perspectives will help us gain a deeper understanding of the topic at hand and stimulate a lively and informative discussion. Before I invite the chair to begin proceedings, I'd like to lay down a few housekeeping rules. All participants, except the chair and the speaker, will be placed on mute for the duration of the session. Members of the audience are requested to please use the chat box to ask questions. Your questions will be read out during the Q&A session after the speaker concludes. You can also ask questions during the Q&A session by using the raise hand option in Zoom. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to ask a question. Please mention your full name and affiliation along with your questions when writing questions in the chat box. Now, I'd like to invite the chair to take over and carry on with the proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you, Abhigyan, for that introduction. Abhigyan has already, explained what will be the primary theme of our discussion today. And scholar who will be presenting his research findings regard Shantanu Roy Choudhury, research associate with the Institute of Chinese Studies. Shantanu is a young but very promising researcher. He has already come out with an important book on South Asia. India edition came out last year and Routledge brought out the international edition this year. Shantanu brings out how China's footprint and presence in South Asia has expanded. As you're aware, China has been quite active in South Asia for last several decades, but the nature of Chinese presence in our immediate periphery, particularly in South Asia, has undergone a change, especially in the last decade or so. China's interest in its periphery has become far more strategic in nature as part of its periphery diplomacy, which is again a part of an important component of its larger ambitions of emerging as the preeminent power, first in Asia and eventually globally. Shantanu we'll look at three countries in particular, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And I understand his main argument is that as China's presence expands in these countries, it has also got more involved in domestic affairs of all three countries. And this could be a kind of handicap for China, because it will create complications in China's pursuit of its agenda vis-a-vis these countries. As you know, in Pakistan, China has earlier provided extensive support in the areas of security and defense, including nuclear and missile development of Pakistan. The main strategic clue bringing China and Pakistan was their shared agenda vis-a-vis India and desire to keep India off balance. But since the launch of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in 2015, China has started investing in both economic development of Pakistan as also in sort of underwriting internal stability of Pakistan. So clearly, its role vis-a-vis domestic dynamics of Pakistan has undergone a marked shift. Likewise, in Nepal, I had served in Nepal earlier, and at that time, its agenda was more defensive in character. Its primary interest was ensuring that Nepal doesn't become, sort of a place from where its security interests in Tibet could be threatened. Moving from that position, today China is extensively engaged in Nepal in various areas. It's thinking in terms of developing a rail link from Kerong to Kathmandu. It's undertaking projects, and along with that, it is also deeply involved in domestic politics of Nepal, as Shantu will talk about. I have seen from my own experience in Sri Lanka how, especially since the last phase of the civil war in that country, China got more and more engaged in Sri Lanka, and its interest became far more strategic in context of its larger ambitions, and it got involved in projects like Hambantota Port and Colombo Port, and there again, its involvement in domestic politics expanded exponentially, with credible reports of what is politely described as elite capture. How this will pan out, to what extent this will create complications for China, this is a subject Shantanu will explore in his remarks today, and we'll discuss in today's Wednesday seminar. So let me now invite Shantanu Raichaudhuri to make his presentation. He'll talk about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll have question and answer session. Over to you, Shantanu.
Great. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you again for the very kind introduction. So I'll just share my screen. Is this visible?
Yes.
Great. So yes, as mentioned, today I'll be talking about China's overextension in South Asia, with a specific reference to Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And the crux of it being that, as Ambassador also mentioned, that as China expands its footprint more and more into the region, from initially having just a security angle to it and a strategic angle, again, which Sir brought out specifically with regards to Pakistan, the more it gets invested in other areas, the more liabilities it also has, and it's also liable to domestic economic and political sort of hiccups within those countries. And this, I argue, is again, it's an obstacle to what China's ambitions have been. If you look at the papers, if you look at the speeches, the white papers, the way things are moving now and the several obstacles they're facing in these three countries in particular is not what they had initially envisaged, especially with relations to the Belt and Road Initiative in the region. So, in terms of the overview of my presentation, it's basically looking at how China's transitioned from following a non-interference approach in South Asia to a more overt role. Then, as mentioned, I'll be focusing on Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka as the three case studies to bring this out. And therefore, with the increased involvement in the country's domestic politics and getting caught up in domestic political, economic, and security issues, China appears to have overextended itself. And thus, rather than achieving its foreign policy objectives, Beijing is likely to get distracted, having to react to developments rather than paving the way for deeper engagement. However, China's influence in the region and its ability to recalibrate should not be underestimated, and India should remain vigilant. So before I get into things, just to give an overview of developments in the region. So for South Asia, this year and 2024 have significant events that have the capability to alter domestic and regional politics. In April, firstly, last year, November 22, elections were held in Nepal, which saw political jostling and new alliances being made in months after the results were declared. In April 2023, Bhutan held its National Council elections. This will be followed by the Maldives going to polls in September of this year. And national elections will also be held in both India and Bangladesh in 2024. Additionally, with the tumultuous domestic politics and precarious economic situation in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, South Asia is at an inflection point, and it's at an interesting period for regional and extra-regional actors to play influential roles. And talking about extra-regional actors, China has shifted its approach to South Asia, and this stems from its global imperatives and desire to become a leading global power, and should also be viewed through this lens. And two conferences encapsulate China's shift towards the region and indicate the centrality of the periphery or its neighborhood to its broader foreign policy goals. At the conference on diplomatic work with neighboring countries held in 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping stated that China's neighborhood has major strategic significance and added that there had been several changes in relations between China and its neighbors, which require a more active diplomatic strategy. And subsequently, at the Central Conference on Work Related to Foreign Affairs held a year later in 2014, peripheral diplomacy was emphasized, and the importance of foreign policy to China, to the CCP's long-term objectives. So therefore, from stability and harmony as the earlier focus of China's peripheral diplomacy, national interest and defending its rights in the region are now paramount aspects of China's neighborhood diplomacy. Thus, taken together, the periphery has been elevated in China's strategic priorities, and its approach towards South Asia has been linked to the Chinese dream and to the two centenary goals. So therefore, the strategic dominance of China's periphery becomes critical. And over the past decade, China has recalibrated its approach to the region, which has led to Beijing becoming more invested in domestic developments as it strives to achieve its geopolitical ambitions. Strategic influence has also risen manifold after Xi Jinping's ascendancy to power in 2012, and China's global ambitions were clearly laid out during the 19th Party Congress in 2017. Earlier, China had prided itself on its non-interference approach in a country's internal affairs when it came to foreign policy. However, once China's strategic priorities grew, policy imperatives caused it to become more invested in other nations' domestic political and economic developments. So now, having understood why, where the periphery and the Southeast Asian region plays into China's larger narrative and broader geopolitical aspirations, what are the strategic interests in South Asia? So very broadly, they're all driven primarily by geostrategic considerations. And they revolve around building influence and gaining a geopolitical advantage over other powers while trying to construct a China-centric and favorable order in the region. Four main trends encompass China's engagement that serve Beijing's domestic, regional, and international objectives. First, South Asia consists of developing countries and growing markets, supplemented by an increasing middle class. Given China's export-driven economy, the countries in the region provide ample business opportunities, and the BRI in this aspect facilitates such movements. Second, these nations play an important role in providing business for Chinese companies and state-owned enterprises, again, through the Belt and Road Initiative. Apart from India and Bhutan, South Asia has actively signed up to the BRI, and billions of dollars have been invested, given in loans and smaller amounts in grants. Third, South Asia provides access to the Chinese mainland by circumventing the choke points of the Straits of Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok in Southeast Asia. This happens through the oil and gas pipelines as a part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, as well as through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It also allows China to monitor the sea lines of communications, through which most of the east-west trade and energy transportation takes place. Fourthly, at a strategic level, China's interests in the region revolve around constraining India within its neighborhood and preventing New Delhi developing into a major Asian power that could challenge its position in Asia. By establishing a substantial presence in India's neighborhood, especially in the political and security domains, China compels India to focus on its immediate surroundings. Ultimately, China aims to also become an indispensable partner in the region, regardless of the political dispensation of the countries in the region. And moving to first of three case studies. Pakistan, as we all know, is China's most important relationship in South Asia. The two countries have an all-encompassing relationship spanning political, economic, defense spheres, which is also included and touched upon the nuclear aspect. However, despite the robust political relations between Beijing and Islamabad, Pakistan has not become the partner China envisaged with regard to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, to the CPEC, which has failed to reach its potential. Signed in 2015, the CPEC was the BRI's flagship project that would span the industrial infrastructure development and energy sectors of Pakistan and would result in an era of growth for the nation's economy. It would also be through the CPEC that China would harness the markets of West and Central Asia. The Gwadar port, which is the highlight of the project, located near the Strait of Hormuz, has also limited economic activity and lacks several facilities. Regardless of the CPEC's failures or success, the initiative resulted in a shift in China's approach towards Pakistan. From focusing on political, strategic, and security aspects, the CPEC led a focus and investment into the overall stability and economic development of Pakistan. And as mentioned earlier, underwriting stability has inevitably led it to increasing involvement in the country's fragmented domestic politics and tussle between the army and the political elite. On the economic front, Pakistan's economic crisis and chronic balance of payments problems have resulted in several bailouts from the Chinese, including a $1.3 billion loan in March, $700 million in February, and in November 2022, Pakistan's finance minister stated the country had secured a $13 billion bailout from China. So therefore, rather than reaping the benefits of a growing Pakistani economy bolstered by the CPEC, Beijing has found itself repeatedly coming to Islamabad's financial aid. China will also find itself in a quagmire and will be unable to avoid debt restructuring if Pakistan's economy implodes and it is unable to repay the loans taken for the CPEC. So apart from the economic aspect, there are many protests and threats by several groups that augment the fragile economic situation in the country and make CPEC an unviable investment, becoming a growing liability for China. Baloch nationalists organizations have opposed the CPEC in Balochistan province and have resorted to several attacks in Gwadar and along the CPEC to discourage Chinese investments. Chinese nationals have also been targeted and killed with attacks taking place in Quetta and Karachi. In February 2023, China's foreign ministry warned its citizens that they may be at higher risk. Combined with pressure from the government, it was reported that police in Karachi closed several businesses that were run and frequented by Chinese citizens, fearing possible attacks. For China, therefore, the safety of its citizens at a period when Pakistan is facing increasing terror attacks is paramount. In January 2023, newly appointed Foreign Minister Qin Gang told his counterpart Bhutto that China was highly concerned about the safety of Chinese citizens in Pakistan and hopes that the Pakistani side will continue to take strong security measures in what is quite a strongly worded statement for all-weather friends. However, despite China's concerns over Pakistan's economic and terrorism problems, which affect its own interests in the country, it is unlikely that support will be withdrawn for its all-weather friend. China's asymmetric military, diplomatic, and trade and investment relationship with Pakistan has resulted in significant influence over trade in the country, over the country. Furthermore, the bilateral military relationship is flourishing and has significantly deepened over the last decade, and again is unlikely to be affected by the other aspects of the bilateral relationship. Coming now to Nepal, over the last decade, China's perception of not being able to displace India's dominance and influence in Nepal has changed. From mainly investing in the Nepali monarchy and having limited linkages with political parties, China has become more involved in the Himalayan nation's domestic politics in an attempt to further its own strategic agenda. This has led to attempts at micromanaging Nepal's communist parties and completely disregarding India's sensitivities. The process and results, however, have not always favored China, and it has faced several setbacks in Nepal. So China's objectives, what are China's objectives regarding Nepal, are again threefold. First and foremost, due to Beijing security concerns, it is to influence the Nepali government on the Tibetan refugees living in the country. This is to ensure stability in Tibet and ensure Nepal does not become a hub for pro-Tibet and anti-China activities, including by the United States and India. As a result, this leads to China interfering in Nepal's domestic affairs. For Tibetans in Nepal, their vulnerability increases the closer Nepal grows to China. At Beijing's behest, border forces have been reinforced and Tibetans fleeing China have been handed back to Chinese authorities, along with increasing surveillance on those already in Nepal. And second, by deepening relations with Nepal across the political and economic fronts, it reduces Kathmandu's dependence on New Delhi and provides alternative trade routes while eroding India's influence in the country. Third is to use Nepal as a hub for expanding trade and commercial links into South Asia. So in terms of political interference, the CCP has worked towards unifying the communist parties in Nepal. This is the Communist Party of Nepal Unified Marxist-Leninist, UML, and the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist Center into the Nepal Communist Party, which was formed in May 2018 under KP Oli Sharma and Pushpa Kamal Dahal. The Chinese embassy in Kathmandu has also been known to manage factions within the NCP. So the split of the NCP in March 2021 was viewed as a watershed moment in China-Nepal ties and necessitated a recalibration of relations. Attempts at keeping the NCP together by the Chinese ambassador, as well as by a high-level delegation led by the Vice Minister of the CCP's International Liaison Department, were unsuccessful. The official split was the result of a Nepal Supreme Court ruling that dismissed the existence of the NCP and stated that the new party could not be registered with the Election Commission when it already has a party registered with a similar name. The court also annulled the merger, the 2018 merger of the CPN-UML and CPN-MC, and revived the two parties. This ruling came as an additional blow to China's objectives of unifying the communist factions in Nepal. Nevertheless, rapprochements seem to have taken place when the 2022 national elections led to a coalition government by the two communist parties, thereby signaling a potential tilt towards Beijing and a deterioration of India's influence in the country. China, however, was unable to orchestrate an alliance before elections took place. And weeks after the elections, the Chinese ambassador to Nepal was reportedly actively engaging with political leaders across the board. However, the dynamic and complexity of Nepali politics sunk China's hopes of a period of prolonged influence in the Himalayan nation as political upheaval led to a multi-party coalition forming led by the CPN-MC and the Nepali Congress, after the CPN-UML broke ranks with CPN-MC. And on the development front as well in Nepal, although Nepal is officially a part of the BRI, Kathmandu has preferred to disassociate Chinese projects in the country from the BRI. This aspect came into light most recently in January 2023, when the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu unilaterally called the Pokhara International Airport a flagship project of China-Nepal BRI cooperation. And this came as a surprise to Prime Minister Dahal and other political party leaders. Additionally, given the economic situation in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, Nepal is becoming more cautious when it comes to development infrastructure overtures and will likely push for grants from China rather than loans, a step which Beijing may not easily be willing to take. Ultimately, despite China's attempts and overtures, it has had limited success in Nepal, as highlighted. So looking at my third case study of Sri Lanka, again, this is a relatively much better known topic, and China's relations with Sri Lanka, again, primarily for geostrategic and geoeconomic reasons, as the island nation is strategically positioned just above the shipping routes of the Indian Ocean and has the capacity to develop into regional industrial and transport hub, a concept that China has supported through the Belt and Road Initiative. Close ties with Sri Lanka would also allow China to better monitor the sea lines of communications, which are just below Sri Lanka, during a period when contestation in the Indo-Pacific region has significantly increased. And looking at Sri Lanka's economic situation, or the economic crisis that's been happening over the last year, although China's loans to the country are not the only reason for Colombo's economic woes, China is an integral and influential player in finding a solution. In March 2023, China followed India and Japan in giving its support to Sri Lanka's debt restructuring that would enable a $2.9 billion bailout from the IMF. Until recently, though, Beijing appeared reluctant to cooperate with Sri Lanka's debt restructuring and preferred to take a wait-and-watch approach. Given the amount China has lent to countries across the globe through the BRI, its primary concern was a cascading effect. If it agreed to reduce one borrower's debt, other nations would then take the Sri Lankan example and request similar bailouts from China. It was also reported that China was willing to lend more to struggling countries and reschedule payments that would prolong their economic difficulties by avoiding economic restructuring. So as Sri Lanka grapples with reviving its economy, China has again been forced to reorient its priorities in the country. Rather than focusing on the strategic interests of expanding its footprint in the country and using it as a springboard to the Indian Ocean, Beijing has found its high-profile engagement has brought it, sort of dragged it into domestic economic discourse. And given the strategic nature of China's forays, which not only Sri Lanka also account for in Nepal and Pakistan, it could be assessed that Beijing would be willing to forego economic gains for strategic outcomes, and again, especially in Sri Lanka. At the same time, China is pushing back on the debt trap narrative, which uses Sri Lanka and the 2017 transfer of the Hambantota port to a Chinese company for 99 years as a prime example of the fact that China uses loans to further its strategic interests. So again, on one front, you have Sri Lanka's economic situation, which has caused China to reorient its priorities. And on the other front, you've got this whole debt trap narrative now, which takes Sri Lanka as a key example of the strategy carried out by China, which again, China has to defend itself from. So now this comes at China's overextending itself in the region. So China's engagement, as I've just highlighted, in Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, which was originally driven by geostrategic imperatives, commerce, and alternative trade routes, appears to have been eclipsed by obstacles and hesitations Beijing faces in its relations with these nations. Although China's deep footprints in the region have been bolstered by the BRI and have led to furthering bilateral relations, the extent of its presence has also caused headaches for Beijing. Thus, as China increases its engagement, it becomes increasingly embroiled in domestic politics and then resorts to political interference to ensure its interests are accounted for. It should be noted that the obstacles and apprehensions facing China are not entirely caused by it. External factors such as political infighting, terrorism, and economic mismanagement have been the primary drivers, at least in the three countries I've looked at. The broad extent of China's economic engagement, therefore, has led it to get entangled in these issues. And therefore, it now is having to react to developments rather than paving the way for deeper engagement. And ultimately, as ambitions lead to a more overarching agenda for China, it has got more caught up with domestic politics and dire economic situations. And to manage, elite capture, corruption, and kickbacks have become important elements in China's South Asia toolkit, so to say, an approach to the region to again ensure its interests are taken into account. And finally, considering the importance of the region to China and its increasingly assertive foreign policy, it is unlikely that Beijing will reduce its presence and temper its engagement in South Asia. And this most recently has been seen by the recent signing, of which the picture shows, a logistics hub in Colombo port. In conclusion, for India, which is actively working towards countering China's influence in South Asia, efforts should be made to exploit these fissures. At the same time, Beijing's difficulties in achieving its strategic interests should not make New Delhi complacent, given China's ability to adapt and course correct. China's overall engagement in India's neighborhood are also significantly across the political, economic, and security fronts, and its ability to influence politics should again not be underestimated. India should also take into account China's broader global ambitions, which was spoken of earlier, of which South Asia is an integral part, and develop a response accordingly. Viewing China's forays into its neighborhood purely as a measure to counter and constrain India would be a misjudgment of Beijing's desire to emerge as a preeminent power and achieve the China dream and second centenary goal by 2049. And with that, I thank you for listening and look forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you, Shantanu, for that very clear, concise, and thoughtful presentation on how China has expanded its presence in South Asia. And while its strategic influence has gone up, no doubt about it, it has also got more sucked into domestic, politics of three countries you looked at, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And you are suggesting that this could, be a case of overextension of China's involvement unless it's able to do course correction and try to develop somewhat different strategies for approaching these countries. Now we have the floor open for question answer. We have a couple of some questions in YouTube which are not really on the subject of today's Wednesday seminar. So they are on Pakistan occupied Kashmir and Bhutan. So I'll skip those questions. Let me come to Sugandha Tandon's question on how might the recalibration of China's foreign policy in South Asia impact its broader foreign policy objectives and relationships with other countries. Shantu would like to answer that question.
Sure, sir. Thanks, Sugandha. So, interestingly, before I get directly to the question, what's happening in China's relation to South Asia is not only happening in South Asia. Similarly, China is facing similar, difficulties in Africa as well, where you see that the deeper and the more expansive China's influence and engagement is in the several countries there, it is again facing many hiccups when it comes to especially security concerns for its people. And, there've been reports on recently Chinese hostages taken by rebels and all of that. So it's a sort of broad concept which has taken place specifically in South Asia and Africa, which again needs to be closer studied, of China's engagement in the region. And in terms of how it will impact its broader foreign policy objectives, I think if you ultimately go back to broad objectives, which are, China becoming a preeminent power, and the white papers that have been issued and the two conferences and the reports from them, it's very clear that, at this point, China, like India, does not feature as the major sort of competitor to China. At this point, it is the United States. So in that end, the way China recalibrates itself in South Asia is again more nuanced to to dealing with these and reacting to these developments to ensure that it doesn't get too bogged down by what's happening. So it can focus elsewhere as well. And how it and relations with other countries. Again, South Asia is increasingly important because of the Indian Ocean region, and you have the United States also putting in a broader focus. So definitely, as China again tries to, or again, it deepens its engagement in the countries in South Asia, you will have the United States, you will have Japan, and of course, India. So there will be different competitions and sort of, pushbacks against those interests taking place as well. And the countries in the region will be a part, or to some extent a pawn in those greater games by the larger powers.
Thanks, Shantanu. We have another question in the chat box from YouTube channel. Essentially, it inquires whether in the scenario of a short conflict with India and China, Sri Lanka will allow China to use Hambantota port for PLA Navy.
I don't think this is going to happen. And in fact, if I'm not wrong, so I just today read a report in the print where at the conference in Dhaka, Sri Lanka's shipping minister stated something along the lines that, India has been very helpful and we will not take steps that are detrimental to India's security. So definitely, when something like this happens, it's highly, highly unlikely that Sri Lanka would allow Chinese PLA Navy vessels to come to Hambantota, because again, that makes Sri Lanka a target. That makes Hambantota a target. So I don't see that happening.
I'll fully endorse Shantanu's assessment. Given the nature of India-Sri Lanka relations, it's very unlikely that Sri Lanka will allow PLA Navy use of Hambantota port, especially under scenario of a conflict between India and China. Now we have Ashok Alex raising his hand. So Ashok, will you unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Mr. Santhu. This is also my research topic, so I would like to know more about this. With regarding to China's engagement in South Asia, see, China also engages in regions like Central Asia and Africa, but all those are you can say that they are all mineral-rich or resource-rich regions. But in South Asia, as we know that we are not a resource-rich region, but still, is that the CPEC or the BRI, is that the only reason why China is interested in South Asia, or is any other reason?
Okay, so if I understood correctly, is the BRI the only reason why China is interested in South Asia?
With regarding to CPEC is an offshoot of BRI, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
Is that the only reason why China is still engaging in? Because when it engages, actually it is giving aid to the small countries. They are not. China is not getting much from it. But still, why China is interested in South Asia still?
See, this again can be answered in two different ways. One is you have the reasons for the BRI and the CPEC, which are not only external reasons, which is, in terms of connectivity, which is the strategic aspects of it, but it's also internal reasons. And the internal reasons include, developing the western part of China, and also include giving Chinese state-owned enterprises and companies, businesses outside, more export opportunities to go out as was sort of promulgated. So it's a combination of all these aspects. Trade, of course, is there. You rightly said that minerals, other regions have more of it, but connectivity, the strategic reasons, and especially for the CPEC, part of it, of course, is also, as I mentioned, to keep India occupied within the region. So the minute you have developments, like you've got the highway coming across, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, you've got the Gwadar port with which could have PLA naval ships. Whether or not it's developed, the fact that a ship can berth there is of concern to India. So for these, multitude factors, which again include internal factors within China, external factors for its global ambitions, and transgress economic and strategic imperatives, China has continued to invest in these countries, despite not getting the economic gains that it probably envisaged. But again, I believe that because of the geography of the region where we are, the strategic gains are more than the economic fallout, so to say, that China faces. Thank you. I hope that answers.
Ashok sir, can I also ask one more question, please?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, Chandra, just a small clarification to ask you. Please correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand is that the CPEC is the only initiative which is part of BRI in South Asia. The engagements that China does with Nepal or Bangladesh or Maldives cannot be a part of the BRI. Am I right?
No. So the CPEC, you're right, is a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Most of the projects in these countries, again, so Pakistan has signed up to the BRI, Nepal has signed up to it, Bangladesh has signed up to it, Sri Lanka has, Maldives has. All the projects that China undertakes, the development infrastructure, aid, all of those sort of come under the BRI, sorry. So even the Hambantota port, for example, although it was started in 2008, before the BRI came into existence in 2013, it's been brought under the Belt and Road Initiative umbrella. So it's a sort of all-encompassing umbrella that, which is easy for China to just put everything under there and then project the BRI as, this enormous infrastructure development, technological initiative. Ambassador, if you want to add to that?
No, that's fine. So I think you have answered the question quite well. Now I'll turn to a question in the chat box from Ambassador Kishan Rana. He's inquiring, he's mentioning that it would seem that at the heart of the problems of Chinese projects in Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka is the marginal economic viability of the projects in terms of financial returns. To some extent, a similar challenge has arisen in some African countries. Do you think China has learned from this experience? Is it likely to affect future projects?
Thank you, Ambassador Rana. Yes, to some extent, I do believe that China has learned from this because if you remember, I think a few years back, the Chinese had sort of pivoted the BRI away from just large infrastructure projects because they understood that we're not making too much money on this. It's taking too long, we're getting bogged down by several different factors. And they said that, we will now be more sustainable, have smaller niche projects. So yes, to some extent, they have believed that just, going into building ports and all is not going to help them economically. But again, as we see recently, despite these statements, they're still investing huge amounts. The signing of the Colombo logistics port, last week or 2 weeks back is a sort of case in point, where despite the economic situation in Sri Lanka, despite the low probability of making economic returns from there, they're still putting in money, investing, engaging the country. And I think this, again, is more due to the fact that they are willing to forego these limited economic gains for strategic advantages, especially when it comes to South Asia.
Thanks. We have more questions in the chat box now. Question from Rohil. As China's influence and power grows, it's expected that it would be increasingly sensitive to the domestic politics of states, especially neighborhood. So what would distinguish overstretch from expected involvement and interest? Even if the involvement do not pan out in their favor every time, China might still find value in remaining engaged in day-to-day affairs of its neighbors, taking steps as expected costs, taking in stride, the cost as something which is part of their strategy.
So of course, I mean, this is all part of diplomacy, that despite whether developments take place that are in favor or that go against you, it is in China's interest to remain engaged in the neighborhood, especially when you again link up the neighborhood to its peripheral diplomacy and to its wider ambitions. So in that sense, even if, and again, that's what you see, China engages, while historically in the neighborhood, it has sort of picked one party or, a certain family or political dispensation. But even when the opposition is in power, it still engages and tries to further its interests regardless of the political dispensation. So that definitely, because if a ruling party in a country comes up which is very anti-China, then for China to stop engaging them for strategic gains or to further their ambitions would not be a viable option. It would just be to engage. And again, this is where China's toolkit of elite capture, corruption, kickbacks, that all plays in as well, because then they try and support the person or the party who is favorable to them.
Let me now turn to more questions from audience. Admiral Muralidharan has raised his hand. Admiral would like to unmute and ask you a question.
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador Ashok. Thank you, Shantanu. My question is related, as you know, being from the mariner, the PLA Navy. As you know, their white papers, etc., have indicated what they want to grow. But do they have the kind of money to continuously keep pumping in for the expansion? And do you see it? Well, it is an existing threat to us, but do you think they're going to keeping their forces in and around India now that they're making a lot of inroads into the Saudi Arabia, etc.? Are they going to have a lot more bases in that area?
Thank you, Admiral. You're right. Money, again, the way, especially after COVID, you see the Chinese economy not doing as great as it used to be doing. But I think when it comes to strategic objectives, they will still find a way. And now a lot of what they had invested, the reason for you see all these debt traps or is because the loans are now coming to fruition. So now it's payback time. And this is where countries are getting stuck. You have Sri Lanka, you have Zambia, Maldives again next couple of years. So yes, you are right that they don't have as much money as before to pump in, which was the previous decade where they were just pumping in, giving loans. And this, I think, combined with the learning that we need to be more sort of concentrated in how we lend, has resulted in the pivot I previously mentioned, where they're trying to become more sustainable, put it into more niche sort of projects. But again, it's it's a dichotomy, because you have them saying that on one end, but on the other end, they are still investing in ports, in all these mines, in these huge projects, which they will not make back money for at least a decade. So it's at this point, I don't have a simple answer, but it's just a wait and watch. And in terms of the Indian Ocean and the PLA Navy, again, bases, there's a whole question of bases versus places. Do they really need a base, or do they just need a dock or a friendly country who can give it access to replenish and refuel and all of that? And no doubt that, in the future, there will be an increasing PLA presence in the Indian Ocean. It's something which I'm sure, our military is also looking at and studying, but maybe not now because, the focus is still on the Eastern Indo-Pacific. But as their interests sort of broaden, as their capabilities grow, in the next decade, you could probably see a decade or two, an aircraft carrier strike group coming into the Indian Ocean. So that shouldn't be ruled out. It should just be, and we can't prevent that. It's all about how we manage it, because you can't stop, national waters, a lot better. So there's nothing we can really do about it, rather than just manage it and have policies and sort of protocols in place, or liaison with our friendly partners on how to approach this when it finally does happen, because I do believe that in the future it will happen.
Thank you, Shantanu.
Thank you. Just if I can, add one point there, Shantanu. No, I agree with you that China's naval footprint in the Indian Ocean region will grow. There's no doubt about it. But my own assessment is that it will grow at a much faster clip. In fact, already they have quite significant presence in Indian Ocean. Chinese submarines started coming into Indian Ocean less than a decade ago. Now they have become a near continuous presence in Indian Ocean. And, so I would actually expect that they will be able to more effectively implement a two-ocean strategy within the next decade. So we have to be prepared for that. Well, let me now.
That's true. I think I tend to agree with Ambassador Ashok, which is one of the reasons we are also started deploying our forces far away and right into, we are also going further into the Pacific, because we also need to show our presence in that area. Thank you.
Okay, so we have, two more participants have raised their hand. Ravi Bhutlingam and Professor Alka Acharya. Ravi, and then after that, Alka. Ravi, can you unmute yourself?
I will. Thank you. Shantanu, thank you for that very crisp and enlightening presentation, which has aroused a lot of interest, as we can see from the questions. So my question is this. At several points in your presentation, you mentioned that the South Asian relationship is strategic for China. And we covered in this presentation, you highlighted 3 countries. And obviously, we are here not discussing India. India is out of this particular scope of this session. But surely it is India which is the big elephant in the room here. And I would suggest to you that China, of course, is dealing with India on a different platform. But are the other South Asian countries really, truly strategic for China if you take away the India connection? And could China have deployed, or should it deploy, find it fit to deploy its resources better in other regions where it finds a better return, both in terms of strategy and in economic terms? Because it's burnt its fingers pretty badly in these 3 countries. And I'm thinking of areas like the Middle East, Iran and Saudi Arabia, that kind of region, the Southeast Asian countries, and elsewhere. And therefore, maybe the strategy with South Asia is really lick your wounds, repair the damage, exit as painlessly and decorously as possible.
Oh, thank you very much, sir. Yes, to some extent, you are right. And Middle East, as we have recently seen, possibly even more Chinese engagement going forward. But I do feel that even if you take out India, the region is strategically important for China. And this is primarily because of just geography. You've got the Indian Ocean there, and because you've got the choke points in Southeast Asia, you have the CPEC, which is envisaged to, connect Western China to Central Asia and the Middle East. And then you've also got similar oil and gas routes in Myanmar. And again, these haven't been successful, as I've brought out, but that was their understanding, to have several, and this combined with the pipelines that go directly into China from Central Asia and Russia, would diversify the various means through which they get energy. And apart from just the energy and resource aspect of it, because of the position of the Maldives and Sri Lanka, where you have the sea lines going through them, is again immensely strategic, not only for China, but for every country in that aspect. The Americans now want to open, I think are opening an embassy in Male. The Australians also are planning something of the sort. And then when you've got, several countries in Europe, the Netherlands, the Germans, the French, of course, when they come out with their Indo-Pacific strategies, and you look at Reunion Island and Diego Garcia, it does become an increasingly sort of crowded, if I may loosely use that term. And therefore, for China to have an influence in Sri Lanka, to have an influence in Maldives, Pakistan as well, Bangladesh again to some extent, Myanmar is strategically important when it comes to geopolitics in the Indian Ocean region.
Thank you.
Okay, now actually Alka has graciously suggested that since Nishant Dilip Sharma, posted his question first in chat box, so he should ask the question first. So Nishant would like to ask the question directly. Why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead, ask the question.
Yes. So Shantanu, you suggested that so China has this principle of non-intervention in sovereign states, and also it tries to say that a nation needs to defend its core national interests, and this narrative has gone up since 2010. And these two sort of have been, logical corollaries, because they served China as a defense against the Western nations raising issues over Xinjiang and also Taiwan. So that, in the sense that you also show some reciprocity in the acknowledgement of these principles and do not intervene in our matters, and let us also protect our core national interests. But as China has overextended its entire presence in the South Asian region, we see that the first principle gets impined upon by the second principle, because China has now its own national interests there in terms of economic engagements. So we see that the both are not going together now. So how do you think China can rebalance these two principles? You suggested that in the case of Sri Lanka, it could be ready to suffer some economic losses as long as the strategic interests are served. Can this be extended to China's engagement with other nations? And do you think is this sustainable in the long run for China?
No, thanks for this question. Of course, if you look at the statements, they're in complete contrast with one another, and also in contrast with what China is doing. But at the end of the day, if you follow Chinese foreign policy, this dichotomy is in several places. You have them saying something and then doing something completely different, which is why I think one of the chiefs of the Indian Armed Forces recently said that we should focus on what China does, not sees, because for them it's very easy to look at American engagement in a country, in Afghanistan, let's say, and point fingers and say you're meddling in domestic affairs, and it defends its own dealings with, let's say, Sri Lanka when it engages on a party-to-party basis. So you have it's more or less the same thing, but the way that they brought out their narrative and the way they sort of pushed the narrative is very interesting because you have these statements which don't go together, but in the way they conduct the diplomacy, the way they make their remarks and it all comes out, they manage to stick by both these, and it rarely comes into contestation when they look at it, which again is a big problem because that's definitely not what's happening on the ground. And in terms of the suffering economic losses for strategic gains, would this happen in other nations? And is it sustainable? No, it's definitely not sustainable. And I don't think it would happen in other nations, which is why I think South Asia is one of, if you look at again the BRI, it's in Central America, it's in South America. Europe, again, you've got Central Asia, Southeast Asia, because of, and I keep coming back to the geographic location of where we are based in our neighborhood. For that sole purpose, I think China is willing to suffer some economic losses for strategic gains. But this would not fly for them in Central America, for example. If they have a project in Panama or in Chile or Uruguay, they might actually rethink their aims and their objectives because it isn't part. And then I link this back to peripheral diplomacy, because as you look at a country, you've got the country and then you sort of work yourself outwards. Because we fall into China's neighborhood, because South Asia is part of its peripheral diplomacy, there is that added priority for it, which will of course not be there the further you go. So I do think that it's definitely not sustainable, but they would be willing to forego economic gains in South Asia and not elsewhere.
Thank you, Shantanu.
Alka, will you unmute and go ahead and ask questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ashok. Thanks, Shantanu. That was a very interesting argument that you have put forward. I'm afraid for about almost 10 to 15 minutes, my internet was unstable. I'll have to listen to the YouTube recording. But I have a more conceptual question, which is sort of addressed to the kind of framework that you're putting out. And I was rather intrigued by this use of the word overextended China. Now, as students, we all read our Paul Kennedy, who had spoken about imperial overstretch. And then subsequently you had, he was of course using it to explain the decline of the United States as the hegemonic power. And then we had other scholars stepping into this debate, and then this whole notion of the, if I'm not mistaken, the hegemonic overreach as opposed to the imperial overstretch. The point being that we are discussing a rising power, China, which clearly has very deep pockets, and as a rising great power, as a global player, it's obviously going to expand its influence in its environs. So when you reach this, when you use the term overextended, in what manner are you using it to define a rising power's expanding influence in its environs? I mean, issues like economic viability, or even say diplomatic influence, ultimately take you to the same point: increasing strategic capital. Okay, so at the end of the day, we are looking at a rising power, which is obviously playing off its losses and gains in this context of a rising power. So how do you actually explain overextension?
Well, thank you, ma'am. That's a heavy theoretical question. No, you're right, because as it is rising at this point, it could go both ways for China. But I feel that given the nature of its engagement with the region, and especially the way in which it's conducted diplomacy and elite capture and corruption, and there have been fascinating reports on hidden debts and the opacity of how it conducts its deals, and development investment and all of that. I think at this point, given you have all these other aspects which are coming into light, it's I do feel that overreach is can be used because they're not they're trying to do too much in not transparent ways, if that sort of makes sense. If everything was above board, then probably they wouldn't have reached the extent of engagement and influence that they have in the region. And this again goes back to the strategic aspects. But because of the way they have been conducting diplomacy and the way that, Sri Lanka, for example, you've got the Rajapaksas they're very close with, and the way that they sort of, put in their chips and have engaged in this manner, I do think that in the long term, despite China being a rising power, it's going to be detrimental to their overarching objectives, whether it's in the periphery or even broader. Because by continuing to engage with them in these ways, and increasingly, it's only going to come more into light. Now, I feel, this has started over the last couple of years, but as the loans come to fruition elsewhere in the world, there will be more problems. I do think that, they have sort of overextended in the way that they have approached how they want to achieve their policy and foreign policy objectives and ambitions. And I hope that answers your question to some extent.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Maybe we can have a more extended discussion on this.
Shantanu, in fact, I also wanted to probe a little bit more on the aspect of overextension. I understand your argument. I'm in agreement with the point you have made that we should locate Chinese interest in South Asia in its larger, global ambitions, that Chinese are willing to pay certain economic cost to make certain strategic gains, and that Chinese are increasingly looking at themselves as a resident power in South Asia. So they believe that getting involved in domestic politics is something quite normal. Though you haven't made the third point, but I'm making the point. But overstretching, there are two aspects to it. One, in terms of resources. And the resources, there has been some clear overextension. If you look at CPEC in Pakistan, there is a very marked downsizing of CPEC because Chinese also have come to realize that CPEC is not yielding economic dividends in the manner they expected. But on the whole, the strategic returns, they believe, are quite substantial. Likewise in Sri Lanka, I think there will be course correction, no doubt about it. But when it comes to involvement in domestic politics, whether there is an overextension or overstretching, which will seriously jeopardize China's pursuit of its larger strategic gains? This is one question I wanted you to look into it a little more, sort of in depth, because we should not underestimate, China's ability for course correction, and also the fact that so far there is no marked pushback to China's, sort of meddling, quote unquote, in domestic affairs, whether it be Pakistan or Nepal or Sri Lanka. There has been pushback, but that has been relatively modest. Actually, there is greater, concern about India's involvement in these countries, with the exception of Pakistan, of course. Do you have any questions, any comments to offer on that?
No, so I think both you and ma'am are very correct. We'll look into this more. And yes, it is very interesting that, we sitting here are bringing out these aspects, whereas in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan, it's a very small debate, if at all, in terms of China's political meddling in domestic affairs. So that, I think, is also an interesting way of how they have managed to, whether it's just, again, elite capture, the narrative that they've been successful in pushing, but or just the level of influence that they have, which I believe in Sri Lanka, for example, despite the Rajapaksas being out of power in 2017, the opposition could do nothing when it came to pushing back on China, when part of its campaign was on sovereignty, on that we should not sell out to China, so on and so forth. But when they came to power, they realized that we can't stop the projects. It's not economically viable for us. And given the influence that the Chinese had, they just had to sort of continue. But no, I've taken these points down, and will definitely look into it in more detail. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the floor? Would like to make any concluding remarks, Shantanu?
No, so I think I've said.
Well, let me conclude in that case. I believe we had really fascinating discussions on China's growing presence in South Asia, specifically in 3 countries: Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, and how China's agenda in these countries has expanded in very significant manner. How China is increasingly looking at its periphery in a very strategic way, where it's not just a question of seeking expanded influence, but perhaps looking at strategic dominance down the road. And as Shantu brought out very correctly, we should not look at China's presence in South Asia only in context of a desire to countervail India. Their agenda is much bigger in South Asia, and we should be mindful of that. Pakistan, for instance, CPEC only partly about India. There are other drivers of CPEC as researchers, as China watchers. We shouldn't be unmindful of. But I believe discussions we had today will help us to understand China and South Asia in more nuanced manner. I would like to compliment Shantanu on his presentation. I understand he's working on a research paper on the subject, and we look forward to reading his paper in near future. Thank you very much. Thanks to the audience for very lively discussions we had this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
With this, then, we will wrap the session, and we thank our speakers for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion will be available on ICS's YouTube platform. We would like to welcome everyone for the next Wednesday seminar titled Transportation History and Circulation of Chinese Convict Workers and Plants to the Nilgiris in the Mid-19th Century. The next speaker will be Dr. Joe Thomas. We at the ICS conduct seminars every Wednesday. Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you.